What's up, church family? Hope you're doing well today. I'm rocking that new CCBC hat swag. If you ordered one, you'll be getting yours soon. Anyway, I just wanted to do our next discipling video in our discipling series. And the question is, when should a discipling relationship end? Now, that's a strange question to ask, isn't it? Because when we think about, ending some kind of relationship, we think of like a boyfriend or girlfriend breaking up, or even worse, a husband and wife getting a divorce. We hear of boy bands or girl bands breaking up and going on their own, or a company basically going in a different direction, and maybe the vice president has decided to go and start their own company and go in a different direction. We typically never like that kind of language, do we? Because when we hear break up or end, we think it's necessarily for bad reasons. Well, it certainly can be. And that's often why things like that do happen. But brothers and sisters, I want to ask a question more in the positive light. When should a discipling relationship end? And what I mean by that is, have you ever heard of the phrase failure to launch? It's the terrible statistic of how many young men, even young women, well into their mid to late 20s, even to their 30s, are still kind of eating ramen noodles and living in their mom's basement playing video games, or just perpetually living as if they're still 12 or 13 years old and never actually doing something with their life into adulthood, like getting a job, getting their own place. Really just failure to mature in basic life skills and life experiences like vast portions of humanity have done throughout human history. Well, brothers and sisters, the same way it goes with our discipling relationships. Discipling relationships can end for all sorts of reasons. They can certainly end because you move to a new state, new city. Obviously, you get married. There's a change from single to marriage. Or maybe a dear friend that discipled you passed away. Those are all things that do happen. But I'm talking about, when should a discipling relationship end? By a conscious decision. And not for really bad reasons, but for actually good ones. And let me offer a few principles to think through. Number one, the person you've been learning under seems to have a fruitful ministry in spending themselves to a lot of people. And it seems that you might be taking up more time than you probably should compared to where you were 1, 2, 3 years ago. In other words, you're seeing people where you were at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago, needing that teaching, encouragement, mentorship, or one-to-one time that you used to have. But now, you're not so much. You've matured quite a bit. In other words, you begin to notice, I love this relationship. I love this mentorship. I love the teaching I've received from this individual. But I kind of need to share the wealth. I need to not be jealous or territorial, and also just understand this person is being used by the Lord, and I need to be generous with my time to not in any way kind of hog that time or get in the way. Another reality is, if you yourself are not, quote unquote, paying it forward. In other words, you're not exporting what you've been imported into your life. You're not multiplying disciples yourself. You find yourself actually codependent. You feel like this is the only person you can learn from. You mimic and imitate and parrot this person so much that you act and talk as if there's no one else that can teach the Bible, teach you how to walk with Jesus, or disciple you in your own life. And guys, this can happen from friends to mentors to pastors to churches to Bible study leaders, all sorts of people. And so we have to ask ourselves, are we actually growing lazy, codependent, to the point where we might even be idolizing someone. We kind of find ourselves relying on their voice, their opinion, and their life experiences too much. And we find ourselves actually following a person more than we are following Jesus, who reigns and rules over our life. I think another positive reason to end a discipling relationship is to actually trust the sovereignty of God. Brothers and sisters, we can become very clingy and we can become too attached to a good thing. Just from a personal standpoint in my life, I can count off plenty of people in my life that at different seasons were tremendous blessings to me, and I really needed them. I think of Gary Johnson in my early 20s, a pastor at Woodlawn Baptist Church in Garden City. He's no longer there, he retired. But in my early 20s, he would text me and call me pretty frequently. We met up probably once or twice a month. And he was a very constant presence in my life, probably for 4 to 5 years. Maybe even longer than that, honestly. And then there was Brooks Cale. Brooks I've known on and off for 20 years. He was my pastor, both in my teen years, but then in my early 20s again. He and I met up probably once a month for 3 years. Really grew in many ways together and gave me a window into pastoral ministry in my own church on how to be a Barnabas to him. But there came the time where the Lord gave me the opportunity to pastor. And, Brooks and I didn't meet up or connect as much after I became a pastor, but that was okay. And I can even remember, obviously, Mark Dever for, 4.5 years at CHBC. And I can remember being there and obviously being one of the best times in my life when it came to sharpening my convictions, giving me a vision for the future, giving me encouragement, giving me lots of tremendous experiences to mature and grow in my discipling, or in my discipleship. But I can remember Mark Dever himself said, Blake, I would love for you to be here the rest of your life if you wanted to, but that would be super selfish of me. He said, there's so many churches out there that don't have good preachers, don't have faithful pastors. And brother, it would be selfish of me to try to keep you for myself. And Mark's exemplified that pretty much throughout his entire 30-year ministry at Capitol Hill Baptist. He rarely, if never, keeps his best and most fruitful disciple makers. He pours into them, he trains them, he equips them. But he knows that the kingdom of God is much bigger than himself, much bigger than his own church. And he's super generous and never territorial or manipulative. And so that's played a huge impact on my own life. And I could come up with story after story after story of ways that we can positively end discipling relationships without necessarily losing a friendship or it ending for a bad reason. It can simply be, it's actually good for us to launch out, to wean ourselves off being too dependent on a particular individual or, maybe a married couple or whatever. I'll give you a negative reason, a negative example of what happens when you don't do this, even on a church-wide scale. I remember probably, it's coming up on about 10 years ago, there was a lady into her, 60s or 70s, and she was in a church that honestly had been dying probably for about 15 years. And I remember sitting down with her and talking with her and basically just asking, hey, can you just walk with me? Why did you join this church back in 1994, whenever it was, 1995? And I remember thinking, this church is dying. It's practically dead, but it's dying. There doesn't seem to be a bright future for this congregation. They couldn't keep a pastor for more than 2 to 3 years on average. So why did this lady stay at this church the whole time? Well, she had given me a story about a time in her life where she went through a really bad divorce. And this church, out of all churches, was the place where she showed up. And she was loved and cared for, heard and seen, and she stayed. Now, in one sense, that's awesome. praise God, there was a church that was a refuge for her. But eventually she got married again. And then 15, 20 years passes. That church started dying. And so she wasn't regularly getting great teaching. There really weren't a lot of mature Christians being raised up to mature and mentor and disciple others. And quite honestly, when you looked around at the church, it dwindled down to about 12 people, 14 people. And I asked, why are you still here? And I want to just give you the answer, what she gave me, that still has stayed with me all these years. She just said, this is my home. I've been here for this long. I love this place. In other words, this geographical location, this brick and mortar, this nostalgia of a place. But there was no mentioning of teaching. There was no mentioning of deep, abiding relationships with individuals. She, in many ways, was stuck in the past, stuck in a place and time that was dear to her. But she held on to that and was blind to what was all around her, which was decline and really a lack of fruit. And personally, I think it showed up in her life. And so, friends, the same way it can be for us. We can be following an individual, following a church, following a pastor, following a ministry, following a married couple, following a friend or whatever. And it can be blind loyalty. Maybe we held on to a situation or a circumstance, a church or ministry or whatever at some point in our life where we grew a lot spiritually. But the reality is that we've held on to it too long because it doesn't seem to be bearing all that good of fruit anymore in our life. And friends, sometimes that's for bad reasons, but sometimes that's God's way of saying you need to let go. You need to wean yourself off. You need to export what's been imported to you. And so, friends, it doesn't have to be a mechanical deal where you have the DTR, the breakup conversation necessarily. It can be for positive reasons. I mean, missionaries. Think about a missionary. Missionaries are typically and biblically sent out by churches. And I know many missionaries who've loved their church and didn't want to leave their church. But as God began to stir in their heart, the Lord was preparing them for the mission field. And that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. It doesn't mean they were leaving for bad reasons. They were going out of obedience and the overflow of following Jesus. Not as a negative running from something, but they were going to something. So, brothers and sisters, I hope this is a useful thing to think about. When should a quote-unquote discipling relationship end? We're not saying break up a friendship. We're not saying anathematize a church or write off a pastor or dismiss a ministry. But what we are saying is know that God has different purposes for different ministries and different people at different stages in our life. It is a unique thing if you're in the same church for your whole life. I don't think that's normal. But God can keep someone at a church for decades, and that can be awesome. God can keep a friendship in our life for decades. Praise be to the Lord. But we have to also understand it's not abnormal for Him to bring people into our life, use them in our life, and vice versa, us be used of God in their life for a particular time, for a particular purpose. And then the Lord makes it plain and known through some of the things I mentioned that it's time to wean ourselves off, wean the other person off, so that they might join hands with other Christians in making disciples who are making disciples. So pray for wisdom in that. Pray for wisdom in that. And pray that in all things, Christ would be honored. Whether we are starting a discipling relationship, ending one, or helping others do that well. God bless.